Salawat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad. We're now going to start the program with a recitation of Quran.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وقال ربكم ادعوني يستجب لكم إن الذين يستكبرون عن عبادتي سيدخلون جهنم داخرين. الله الذي جعل لكم الليل لتسكنوا فيه والنهار مبصرا إن الله لذو فضل على الناس ولكن أكثر الناس لا يشكرون. ذلكم الله ربكم خالق كل شيء لا إله إلا هو فأنى تؤفكون. كذلك يؤفك الذين كانوا بآيات الله يجحدون. الله الذي جعل لكم الأرض قرارا والسماء بناء وصوركم فأحسن صوركم ورزقكم من الطيبات. ذلكم الله ربكم فتبارك الله رب العالمين. هو الحي لا إله إلا هو فادعوه مخلصين له الدين الحمد لله رب العالمين. قل إني نهيت أن أعبد الذين تدعون من دون الله إني نهيت أن أعبد الذين تدعون من دون الله لما جاءني البينات من ربي وأمرت أن أسلم لرب العالمين. هو الذي خلقكم من تراب ثم من نطفة ثم من علقة ثم يخرجكم طفلا ثم لتبلغوا أشدكم ثم لتكونوا شيوخا ومنكم من يتوفى من قبل ولتبلغوا أجلا مسمى ولعلكم تعقلون. هو الذي يحيي ويميت فإذا قضى أمرا فإنما يقول له كن فيكون. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Thank you very much for that recitation. We're now very fortunate to have Diana Darke, who will be speaking to us on about her book, Stealing from the Saracens, How Islamic Architecture Shaped Europe, which was one of BBC History magazine's best books of 2020. She is an author, a prolific writer with a number of books, including The Merchant of Syria, My House in Damascus, and The Last Sanctuary in Aleppo. She is also an Arabist, an occasional BBC broadcaster. Her works appeared in multiple media outlets, including The Guardian, FT, Sunday Times, Daily Telegraph, and Araby. And she's worked in a number of different locations. We're very fortunate to have her today speaking to us on her book. Let's welcome her with a round of applause.
Good evening. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, speaking to a completely different audience to the people I normally speak to, but I'm always delighted to speak to new people, and I always believe in saying yes to every invitation to talk about my favorite subject. So I'm delighted to see you all here. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the book, but I shall assume that you're not familiar with it and start from the beginning and just explain what the title is all about, because the title itself has been quite controversial, Stealing from the Saracens, How Islamic Architecture Shaped Europe. And the reason for the word Saracen is because that was the language of the time in the 17th century when Christopher Wren, one of Britain's greatest architects, the architect of St. Paul's Cathedral, which you'll see there in the picture, he said that, and this 300 years ago, he said that in building the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, he used Saracen vaulting because it was the best, he said. So he was a man of science. He went for the best in everything, and he believed that when you build, you should build for eternity. And so with his great creation of St. Paul's Cathedral, he used the absolute top technology that was available at the time, and he acknowledged that that was Saracen vaulting. So he also had a theory that what we call the Gothic style, he said, should rightly be called the Saracen style. And he wrote this towards the end of his life when he lived to be 90, which was pretty incredible 300 years ago. And he reached this conclusion at the end of a long and productive life based on a lifetime's experience of looking at other buildings, and he observed the similarities between what everybody in Europe was calling Gothic architecture, a term that actually was only coined in the 16th century by an Italian art critic. So, you know, the whole term Gothic is modern anyway, if you like. And so Christopher Wren questioned this right at the end of his life. But it was done in private correspondence. He didn't write about it publicly, so it never caused any particular waves, and was only actually uncovered after his death, when his sons and his grandson published some of his correspondence. So it wasn't well known that Christopher Wren, you know, our greatest British architect, saw this in architecture. But to me, it had always been obvious. You know, as somebody who's spent a long time in the Middle East and who's, you know, lived and worked across the Middle East most of my life, and also familiar with European cathedrals, you know, because I was brought up as a European. My mother was German, my father's English. We spent in my childhood, we travelled extensively across Europe, just as a matter of course, in the summer holidays, and we used to visit cathedrals. And so I always, once I switched to Arabic at university, the similarities were obvious to me. It wasn't something I'd even ever questioned. So because it was so obvious, it never occurred to me to say anything about it. And then until the fire at Notre Dame in April of 2019. And when I saw the sort of outcry across the world about the fire, and particularly the French, who are, after all, you know, famously secular, sort of saying our national heritage is going up in flames, our cultural identity is going up in flames, it actually made me a little bit angry. And I thought, what are they talking about? You know, their cultural identity, this building, you know, pretty much nothing in that building has anything to do with Europe. It's all the features that form Gothic architecture have come in from elsewhere. And so, sort of slightly in anger and frustration, I put out a tweet on the morning of the fire saying, you know, the ancestor of Notre Dame is still standing on a hilltop in Syria called Kal Blauze. I'll be showing a picture of it later. And like all Gothic cathedrals, it originated in the East. Never expecting anything, to come of it, but the response was just phenomenal. And I realized, my goodness, people don't even know this stuff. This is extraordinary. So I then, on my website, wrote a blog about it, explaining in more detail how all the features had come in from the East. And within hours, I was contacted by different media outlets saying, "Can we reblog your piece straight away?" And before I knew it, the whole thing, it was in Chinese, it was all over the place, all from some random tweet. And so my publisher, who actually wanted me to write a book about something completely different, when we met up and I was ranting on about the Notre Dame fire and saying how angry I was about it, he said, "Look, it sounds to me as if you ought to be writing a book about that then, rather than what I'm trying to persuade you to write about." So it all came about, honestly, through the Notre Dame fire, because I genuinely believed that this sort of knowledge was widespread, and it was only on realizing that people didn't understand it that I felt compelled, actually, to write the book, to put the record straight, almost. So that's what the book is about. And the stealing from the Saracens, the reason for the stealing is the derivation of the word Saracens. It's one of the several theories about it, but personally I think the most likely one is from the Arabic saraka, to steal. So sariqin, people who steal. So we called them people who steal, because that's what Europeans called all Arab Muslims at that time, ever since the Crusades, Saracens. So it's a double irony. It's saying, isn't it ridiculous that we call them thieves when we took things from them? So it's actually meant to be slightly humorous as a title, but irony doesn't translate well into Arabic, so it was lost on a lot of people who took it very literally. So the picture you're looking at now, so there's Notre Dame on burning, and on the right there is a statue of a decapitated saint, Saint Denis, and that statue stands on the front, the west facade of Notre Dame Cathedral, and he is regarded as the patron saint of France, the great patron saint. And Saint Denis Basilica is where Gothic architecture, according to European art historians, is miraculously born, as if it just pops out like some sort of miracle virgin birth, So anyway, the point about this, so when I started to look into this figure of Denis, so it turned out it's one of these medieval models, of which there are so many. There are actually 3 Denises, and their identities get conflated in the Middle Ages because there's no internet, there's no way that people can check up on any of these facts. So whatever it is that the clergy tells people, the abbots and the bishops, people just believe it. And there was no way of checking it. So the figure of Denis, so there's this Denis, who's the decapitated saint, decapitated by the Romans. Then there's meant to be another Denis, who is meant to be a disciple of St. Paul, who wrote a very influential paper called The Celestial Hierarchies, all about light and how light is God. And so people theorized that light and Gothic so Gothic architecture was all about letting in the light through the big, tall windows. But it then turned out that this person claiming to be this disciple of St. Paul was a fraud. And in later centuries, it was discovered that he wasn't any such thing. He was his real identity was as a Syrian 5th century monk. So, from all this convoluted stuff about the origins of Gothic, it turns out that it's all based on nonsense, essentially, complete nonsense. And so this Denis, he gets called pseudo-Denis. It's all very complex theological stuff, but it doesn't bear scrutiny, basically. So the story leads us now to Syria. And I don't know whether any of you have been fortunate enough to go to Syria, but it's a country I've spent a lot of time in. And of course, I bought my house in Damascus, which I still have in the old city. But what we're looking at here is in what is today Idlib province, which is under rebel control, so it's not under the Assad regime. And it's an area a little bit south and west of Aleppo in this limestone hills. And it is the most incredible collection of about 2,000 early churches, which is unique in the world. There is no other collection of early churches like this from the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. Because remember, for the first 300 years, Christianity was a persecuted religion, so there was no Christian architecture at all. People had to worship secretly, in caves or in their houses. So only when Constantine, the Roman emperor, accepted it as the official religion of the Roman Empire, did Christian architecture finally become something that was recognizable. So in Syria, you have this astonishing concentration of early churches, and they are very, very influential. So, monks from Ireland would travel out to Syria to learn how monasteries were built and to learn about the hermit lifestyle. They went to Egypt and to Syria. But the main pilgrimage site at that time was a place called St. Simeon's Basilica. And on the right-hand side there is the remains of St. Simeon's stump. It was actually a pillar, St. Simeon stylitis. Stylus is the Greek for pillar. And he was a hermit who used to preach from the top of his pillar. But he became so famous that people from all over Europe would travel, would go on pilgrimage to his basilica to hear him preach. And then when he died, the basilica was built there. And all along the pilgrimage route, churches were built. And the one on the left there is this famous one, Kalb Lauze, which has got the twin towers flanking the monumental entrance. And that is this, they designed it like that to welcome pilgrims in. I mean, this was the Santiago de Compostela of its day. I mean, it was very famous all across Europe. And there are towns in France named St. Simeon. There are stained glass windows with St. Simeon. So there's a lot of evidence of how influential this was. And the hills in which these early churches were built are all limestone. And so stonemasonry is a skill in Syria, literally as old as the hills. And this is a close-up of one of the capitals on the columns that is acanthus leaves carved to look as if they're blowing in the wind. And when you think that this is built in 490, so we're talking 5th century, the quality, the level of stonemasonry skill there is phenomenal, higher than anything else that existed anywhere in the world at that time. And so this is the, if you like, the foundation on which the first Muslim dynasty then, when the Umayyads came into Syria, and of course it was a Christian, the whole region was Christian. And when I talk about Syria now, I mean historic Syria, ancient Syria, not the sort of amputated stump that is modern Syria. I mean, ancient Syria used to reach right down to, it incorporated Jerusalem and used to reach right down to the Red Sea. It incorporated the Dead Sea as well. So it's a huge area. And of course, it was covered in churches. So when the first Muslim dynasty came in, this is the architectural foundation upon which they built. And the very first monumental building that the Umayyads had as their statement, if you like, that we are something different, we are a new religion, because up until that time, there had been so many Christian heretical sects that the local Christians actually just assumed that the Muslims were just yet another heretical sect. So, because Christians were allowed to continue worshipping in their own churches. So the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem here, which is such a well-known, iconic building, was the very first Umayyad building, the very first Islamic statement building, if you like, that we are a new religion. And so some people would look at that and say, oh, yes, well, it's just a Byzantine building, isn't it? It's just copying a Byzantine style. And in some ways it is. The octagonal shape is used in Byzantine tombs, and the dome, of course, is also a Byzantine thing. But there are some very, very important differences here that appear now for the first time at the beginnings of Islamic architecture. And the first one is that all the tile decoration is on the outside. In Byzantine churches and cathedrals, they're very plain on the outside, and they all the tile work and mosaic work is on the inside. So this is new, that it's all on the outside, and there's an inscription running all the way along the top there, which is actually a statement addressing the Christians of Jerusalem and reprimanding them for believing in the Trinity, for believing in three gods rather than one. So as I said, this is the big statement that for the first time they make. And then inside the Dome of the Rock, there are two other very, very important developments that are not that were not in Byzantine architecture before. So first of all, at the bottom there, the arcades, the four arcades, two on the edges are slightly pointed, the arches, and then the two in the middle are rounded. So this is the first time that the pointed arch is appearing in a piece of monumental architecture. And then up, just under the dome itself, you'll see another arcade of trefoil arches. Again, tremendously important developments that then come into Europe and form a very, very important part of Gothic architecture. So this is another close-up of an Umayyad palace. This is from Qasr Mushatta, which is one of the Umayyad desert palaces. It's actually in the museum in Berlin now, in the Islamic History of Art Museum there. Oh, thank you. And you can see, again, this incredible stonemasonry skill and how the subject matter is all about nature and full of the sort of bursting with life. It's sort of flowers and vegetation everywhere and animals entangled in the vegetation. It's full of this new energy that comes with early Islamic architecture. And again, the Syrian stonemasonry skills are very apparent. And then the other very important thing that appears in this early Umayyad architecture is what is widely considered to be the first example of the rose window. And this has been reconstructed from the excavations at Khirbat al-Mafjar, which is near Jericho in the occupied West Bank. And it was found with coloured glass underneath it, very high up in the gable of the caliph's audience hall. So again, it was clearly designed as a decorative window up high to cast a kind of special light. And so, of course, it takes many centuries, but it evolves eventually into the absolute peak of rose window and the use of coloured glass in Chartres Cathedral there in the 13th century on the other side. So that was the Umayyads in Syria. But of course, what happens then in 750 is that the Abbasids come to power. They wipe out the Umayyads. They move the capital to Baghdad, and they kill all of the Umayyad ruling family except one prince, Abdurrahman, who manages to escape. And he flees all the way across North Africa and founds the new Umayyad dynasty in Spain, in Cordova. So what we're looking at now is an aerial picture of the Cordova Mosque, where Abdurrahman essentially creates Syria in Spain. He models the mosque in Cordova directly on the Damascus Umayyad Mosque. He uses the same proportions, it's the same layout. And when we're looking at this aerial photo, it's had two extensions, so the original one was built soon after 750, but then it was extended a couple more times, and most recently in the 10th century. And by this point, in the 10th century extensions, you have now appearing for the very first time on European soil the earliest ribbed vaults. So this is the ribbed vault directly in front of the mihrab of the Cordova Mosque. And actually, just before we focus on the ribbed vault, look along the bottom there. Can you see the trefoil arches there? That forms the top of the mihrab. So this is an example of how Islamic architecture is using the trefoil arch, which is such an important thing in Gothic architecture later, and which, of course, fits very well into the idea of the Trinity in Christianity. But well before that, the Muslims were using it as a sort of sacred shape in the most sacred part of the mosque. But the ribbed vault itself was examined for the first time fairly recently. I think it was 2017, by a couple of Spanish structural engineers who got permission to go in and do a proper structural survey on it, and they were completely flabbergasted by what they found. They said they had never seen such a perfect example of geometry. It was just a masterpiece, and it has never needed structural repair in its entire 1,000-year existence. And at the back of the Cordova Mosque, on one of the walls, is a display of all the masons' marks that were found. So this is the masons who worked on the mosque, and when you look at all those marks, you can see that they are overwhelmingly Muslim names. People were literate. This is the other extraordinary thing. In the 10th century, ordinary craftsmen in Europe were not literate at all. They couldn't, they could barely scratch sort of straight lines and things for their masons' marks. But here in Andalusia, you have very complex, cursive, literate craftsmen who have a level of geometry that is way, way beyond anything that existed in Europe before. And this is now a close-up of the mihrab in Cordova, where, as I mentioned, you've got this row of trefoil arches at the top. You've got the horseshoe arch, and all these elements. You get then the interlocking arches appear in Cordova for the first time. So on the right-hand side there is one of the exterior gates in Cordova with these interlocking arches, which then form a pointed arch. And on the left-hand side there, that is the Galilee Chapel in Durham Cathedral, which directly copies from the Andalusian Cordova Mosque, to the extent that, in fact, it's almost certain that it would have been Muslim masons who were responsible for building this, because you simply couldn't have built it. You couldn't just tell your local builder, oh, build me a couple of interlocking arches, they just wouldn't have had a clue how to do it. You had to get the top people in to do this kind of thing. And still in the Cordova mosque, you can see the use of arches, and as you know, I'm sure, the love of arches in Islamic architecture, the arch never sleeps is the proverb. They just loved arches everywhere, all different styles. And in Cordova, you have every single type of arch. So it evolves from the trefoil arch to what's called the cinquefoil arch, so where you've got 5 lobes like this coming around, and then you get 7 and you get 9, you get more and more. But of course, because it then at the time of the Reconquista in the 15th century, when the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella reconquered the area and plonked a cathedral in the middle of it, so today it is the most weirdly schizophrenic building where it's so obviously a mosque, and yet you've got crucifixes put in all the sort of chapels. They've created chapels all around the edges. So it's a very strange feeling being there today. And then this is actually the synagogue in Cordova, just to illustrate how the Jews in Andalusia also used Islamic architecture. They really liked it and used it in their synagogues. And when they were expelled from Spain by the Catholics, they actually, when they rebuilt synagogues elsewhere, like in Berlin and places, they actually used Islamic architecture. So in Berlin, the synagogue is sort of neo style where they just reused it all, the styles that they loved from Spain. So now I'm going to focus specifically on the pointed arch, because we actually happen to know exactly how the pointed arch found its way into cathedral architecture. And the story begins in Amalfi Cathedral. Now, Amalfi is on the Italian coast. And around the year 1000, the Amalfi merchants were the most powerful trading entity. This was before Pisa and Venice and Genoa had reached their heights. They were, the Amalfi merchants were the first. And they were trading a lot with Cairo, and they noticed the pointed arches in the Ibn Tulun Mosque in Cairo, and decided that they liked the elegance of the shape, and they wanted to rebuild Amalfi Cathedral using this pointed arch. So they imported the labour, because again, you couldn't just tell your local builder, build me a pointed arch. So they imported the labour and some of the materials, and the Amalfi merchants funded it all. And so the pointed arch appears then for the first time in Amalfi Cathedral, plus this use of polychrome alternating stonework, which is again a very common Syrian and Egyptian feature in arches. And what happens then is that the visiting abbot comes to Amalfi to buy some special luxury gifts, and he notices the pointed arch, and he thinks, I want that at my abbey at Monte Cassino. So he does the same thing. He imports the workmen and the craftsmen, and so pointed arches appear in Monte Cassino. And then the abbot of Cluny, the absolute powerhouse of the Benedictines, visits Monte Cassino, sees the pointed arches and says, right, I want those in my new building in Cluny as well. And that's it. Once the abbot of Cluny has the pointed arches, everybody wants the pointed arches. The fashion goes crazy, and suddenly all over France in particular, and especially on the Benedictine pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela, which they control, they build churches all the way along the route for the pilgrims to stop at, all using the pointed arches. And this is where you then start to see all these Islamic features appearing in the cathedrals. So this is one of those pilgrimage churches on the way to Santiago. This is at Le Puy, it's called, and this is the cloister at Le Puy. I was there just a couple of months ago, and you can see exactly the use of the arches with the alternate black and white. There is Kufic script on some of the stonework. There is Kufic lettering on some of the woodwork as well, and the vaulting inside is using all the new geometry. And so what happens now is you start to get in things like French Bibles. This is the frontispiece of a French Bible in the 13th century. Images of God as architect, God holding his compass as the master geometrician creating the world. So this again shows that the whole concept of geometry is new in Europe at this point. You know, it's for the European Christians, this is a new thing, whereas of course the Arab Muslims had known about it and perfected it for many centuries before that. But the knowledge is now starting to pass over into the Christian communities. And so this again is another image. This is the very first pictorial map of Jerusalem that ever existed, and it was drawn by a pilgrim. And what struck me as so strange immediately about this is so this is a Christian map of Christian Jerusalem seen through Christian eyes, and yet the building in the center is the Dome of the Rock, a Muslim shrine. How do you account for that? And the reason is that the Templars, in the Crusades, they mistook the Dome of the Rock for the Temple of Solomon, and so they adopted it as their symbol and put it on their coins. And you know their very name, the Templars, you know, comes from the Temple of Solomon. And we have Temple Tube Station here in London. There's Temple Church, which is also modelled on the Dome of the Rock, just around the corner from Temple Tube Station. It's quite interesting to go and see it, actually, and see how close it is to the Dome of the Rock. So it's this very weird thing where the Christians don't even realise that they're basing, they're making the centre of Jerusalem a Muslim shrine. I mean, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is nowhere to be seen in this map. It's all very curious. And then, of course, Venice. I mean, Christopher Wren identified Venice as a very Saracen city. And, you know, St. Mark's Basilica, pictured here, you know, he describes as a Saracen building. And again, you can see it all. I mean, the domes used there, the 5 domes of St. Mark's Basilica used the Saracen vaulting with a hollow centre, if you like. The exterior profile is different to the interior profile, which enables you to use more height. And all the decorative elements there are all taken from Islamic architecture. And again, in Venice, this is a close-up now. On the right-hand side, this is the Doge's Palace, where again you've got this sort of patterning of different colours, the red and the white on the stonework on the front, the very delicate tracery, all of this very sort of detailed decorative ornamental styles are all very much what Islamic architecture likes. And then the palaces, the Venetian palaces on the left there, again you've got chimneys that are looking like minarets, you've got pointed arches, you've got what's called the telephone dial motif there on the palace on the right. That is lifted straight off the facade of a Mamluk palace in Cairo. But the Venetians loved it and openly acknowledged that they thought Islamic architecture and culture was wonderful, and they copied it in every way that they possibly could and revelled in it. And then, of course, the Ottomans later, I mean, Sinan obviously is the great court architect who served under 3 sultans, And in one of his masterpieces, the Suleymaniye Mosque here, again, I mean, the use of the architecture, the dome, the vaulting. But he also, the other remarkable thing about Sinan, and again, this is something I think is common to Islamic architecture, is that he was astonishingly environmental for somebody so long ago. So when the Suleymaniye was built, he devised a system where all the soot from the candles and the oil lamps was funneled up into the dome and through a sort of water filter where it came out as ink that had special properties that repelled insects. So for calligraphy on manuscripts, it preserved the manuscripts for much longer, and then the clean air was released into the city. I mean, it's just astonishing, environmental flair for so many years ago, for the 16th century. And if you look now, this is the Sinan, the Suleymaniye Mosque in Edirne. This is the vaulting of the dome there, which Sinan saw as his masterpiece on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side is the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral. And, they are remarkably similar. And Christopher Wren acknowledged Ottoman architecture. He didn't, I mean, he and Sinan were almost contemporaries. Sinan was a little bit older, but astonishingly, both men lived to be 90 and served under many different rulers in the same way. So they must have been good diplomats as well as good architects. And in one of the chapters of the book, I actually compare the two men. So then, of course, we have the Gothic comes back in the 19th century. We have neo-Gothic, we have the Gothic revival, and suddenly Gothic, from having been out of fashion, and classicism was all the rage for a century or two. Then the Gothic comes back big time. So we've got Big Ben and the Houses of Parliament that are covered in trefoil arches and pointed arches. Big Ben itself going up in registers, as they're called, these different stories, becoming more and more elaborate as it goes to the top, is exactly what Islamic minarets do. And in France, you've got the Gothic revival in Montmartre, where its own website even talks about how it uses Islamic features and it uses Islamic vaulting in its domes. And then going across the Atlantic even to New York, you've got this cathedral in America, which is basically, there it is, it's modern, but it's got everything about the perfect Gothic cathedral. The twin towers flanking the monumental entrance, the pointed arches, the trefoil arches, the rose window, all the features are there, all combined, and it finds its way across the Atlantic. And it's so popular in America that a lot of the American universities go crazy for Gothic. And so this is Yale University, where the Harkness Tower is a Gothic tower. And on the right there is the Lending Library in Yale, which for all the world looks like the nave of a Gothic cathedral. And then finally, you've got the heart of American democracy itself, the US Capitol building, which is using Saracen vaulting in its dome. But of course, without realizing it and without any form of acknowledgement. So this is just a sort of brief overview of what the book is talking about, and it's traced obviously in much more detail in the book itself, with full footnotes and everything. So it's a lot of people have spent their lives working on specific areas of this subject, but without kind of joining the dots, if you like. So, for example, Venice. There's this professor of architectural history at Cambridge, a lady called Deborah, I can't remember her surname now, but anyway, she's mentioned in the book. She's retired now, but she spent 10 years of her life researching Venice and the East, and has written a wonderful book called Venice and the East. So she's done intensive work just on Venice and the connections to the Islamic world. And then other people have done, again, looked at just one aspect. But nobody's come along and sort of joined all the dots and made the big picture in a way that's accessible to the general reader. And so that's what I've attempted to do here, really, to sort of draw all the threads together to show how all these elements have come to form the Gothic cathedrals that we assume are European, but which I'm trying to point out have originated elsewhere. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. We have time for questions.
Hi, thank you for your talk. That was super interesting.
Right.
So when I think of like Gothic architecture, some of the things come to mind, like the vaults and the other things you mentioned, which you said come from like Islamic architecture. But other things that come to mind are like gargoyles and flying buttresses and things like that. Is that also inspired from Islamic architecture, or other, where's that come from, those things?
Well, the gargoyles come from, they're actually come a bit later in Gothic anyway. I'm actually writing a book about all of that now, which is coming out in November, where I'm actually tracing the origins of some of that. And I wouldn't say it's Islamic, no, but in my view, it does come from the Middle East. It comes out of the ancient Egyptian cultures and the ancient Mesopotamian cultures, where the use of animals to ward off evil spirits and things, monsters, fantastical creatures, that don't exist in reality. The use of those sorts of creatures is not Islamic in itself at all, no. But all of these ancient archetypes, if you like, have sort of found their way into Christian architecture. Well, it's a complicated question, actually, and what I'm trying to show in my new book is that actually the one Islamic dynasty that did use animals in that way were the Fatimids. And of course, because they inherited, if you like, the ancient Egyptian traditions through the Copts, and so the whole thing of, in ancient Egypt, you've got gods with heads like a jackal, it's very what's called zoomorphic, I think, a sort of cross between people and animals appearing on the walls of tombs in ancient Egypt. So that use of animals as gods and half man, half god goes back to those very, very early cultures. And it existed in Mesopotamia as well, in the ancient Assyrian. It's wonderful actually to go to somewhere like the British Museum and go to those early, and you can see it all there. That's where it all begins, really. But I think the Fatimids were unusual in that they used, in their art, they used animals a lot and fantastical creatures. And a lot of Fatimid art has been destroyed, so there's not much of it to go and see around the world. But one of the really big sort of gold mines for Fatimid architecture is the ceiling of the Cappella Palatina in Palermo in Sicily. That's the one intact piece of Fatimid art, which is huge. It's the size of this room. The ceiling built in the 12th century. And, well, it's difficult with the naked eye when you stand below to look at it, but there are books written when it was being restored, for instance, when they were able to put scaffolding up and take really close pictures of it. And my goodness, it's stuffed full of fantastical animals, sphinxes and, all sorts of dragon-like things that which are sort of, some of which you find in ancient Persian traditions as well. So it's all come out of the Middle East, these traditions. And I think because the Fatimids, were so significant in Sicily specifically, you do see a lot of it. You do see a lot of it there, and you also see it in Andalusia a bit in secular settings, not in a mosque, obviously, but you certainly see it in, for example, ivory. They carved ivory boxes, and the imagery on that is a lot of animals, all of which symbolize different things, often in pairs, facing each other or back to back. It's all very full of meaning, actually. And I think some of this has passed into the Christian use of it then in cathedrals because it wasn't there before. And this is what's so interesting. It wasn't there before, to the extent that the clergymen of the time are kind of up in arms at where did all this stuff suddenly come from? Why are our churches full of all these filthy apes and strange lions and all the rest of it? And it's as if they didn't ask for it to be there. They don't know what it means. And my own theory is that actually it was brought in by a lot of craftsmen who are just very good at building these things, and you had to put some Christian imagery in, so they did where they were asked to do so. So there'll be pictures of Christ in majesty, on the Day of Judgment, and all those sort of traditional scenes. But then whatever was decorating the capitals of the cathedrals, the bishop wasn't looking at what they were doing there. So I think my own theory is that these things, the Masons just enjoyed themselves on these things and actually built, fairly extraordinary, incredible level of sculpture. I mean, the quality. I mean, you've only got to look at the quality of the carving and think, hang on a minute, nobody in Europe could have done that. It just didn't exist. There were not sculptors of that level. So, the evidence is sort of there in the buildings, but it's very difficult to prove. I mean, I'm setting out a new theory about it all, basically, which I'm sure will be heavily pushed back against.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Fascinating. Just a question following on from the vaulted domes, in the functionality of that, in terms of its acoustics, the cooling factor, sort of having that height advantage where God's house is the tallest building in town. Could that have been a factor in its ease of adoption, where the Gothic, early Gothic buildings in Europe are saying, hey, this is really cool, pardon the pun, say, this is adding value to our buildings in terms of these areas and perhaps more?
Yes, definitely. And I should have mentioned that, of course, the whole thing about the pointed arch, which people then realised, was that it's stronger than the round arch. So you can make your walls thinner and taller, which means you can put in more glass, which reduces the weight of the stonework. And so, of course, what happened then, once people understood that, was in this sort of race and competition that I mentioned between the different bishops. I want my church cathedral has to be bigger than your one. And then I mean, it really was like that. It was a rivalry thing. You had to prove that your town was more important by having the biggest, the tallest. I mean, it's just like what's going on in in Dubai. You have to have the tallest this, the biggest that, just to prove something or other. And it's quite striking, really, that that's how they thought. And then, of course, Beauvais Cathedral, they overreached themselves, and the whole thing collapsed. They got to the limit of what they could do.
Last question before Maghreb.
You said after a few centuries of it going out of trend, Gothic was flared back up, but how did it suddenly flare back up?
Well, I think, I'm not certain about this, but I think it was the Victorians, Queen Victoria, you know, it's somehow associated, you know, Gothic, the Gothic revival, all the sort of Gothic buildings that North London is full of as well, you know. It all kind of comes back in that 19th century. It's the other theory about it actually is that it's a kind of hark back to before the Industrial Revolution, because the Industrial Revolution changes everything. And then there's a kind of reaction against that. And people think, oh, you know, Gothic was so wonderful when everything was hand done and craftsmen were really important. We should go back to that sort of idealized time where architecture was much more intimate, because, you know, the classical facades are very kind of cold, if you like. You know, they're kind of, it's all sort of power statements, really. Whereas Gothic architecture is meant to be, you know, a bit more intimate as a space that it creates.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask a final question just because I have the chance and I have the mic. So from what you're saying, is there any European architecture? Like it sounds like the core of everything, the most well-known architecture in Europe often comes from the East, or always comes from the East, or is there any inherent European architecture?
Not of. I mean, it's a case of. Are you talking Greek now? You know, I mean, the thing is, I was brought up to believe that Greece and Rome invented everything, because people of my generation in Europe were taught that. You know, that was it. You know, that was civilization. You know, Greece and Rome. And so it was only when I studied Arabic and went to the Arab world for the first time that I realized, hang on a minute, you know, there seems to be an awful lot there that isn't getting acknowledged. And Turkey is a place I know very well and have written quite a lot about. And I was astonished to learn that even the Greek gable, you know, that you think of in the temple, you know, that shape, the classic temple, Greek temple shape, even that wasn't a Greek invention. They got it from the Urartians, who were an earlier civilization in central Turkey. So, you know, I mean, it's obvious because you go to Turkey and you see it there, carved on the pediment. And so pretty much everything actually came out of the Middle East. And it's not surprising, because that's where civilization began. So everything began there. You know, the earliest, everything really started in that part of the world. So it's just interesting to track how it then entered Europe. And by tracking the timelines and the context, you know, you can track, you know, there's just so much in Europe, so much architecture of that period that's still there. I mean, that in the Middle East, there's much less of it. You know, that so much of it has been destroyed or lost for one reason or another. You know, but in Europe, my goodness, you know, pretty much every French village has got its Romanesque church. It's just phenomenal. It really shows the power of the church in those days, the wealth of the church in those days.
Thank you very much.
University plans, present Oxford, you know, with the courtyard and the thing around it. Secular architecture.
The cloister, you mean?
Yeah, where in Cordoba, the university is recognized now with the courtyard, you know, and the arcades all around.
Yes.
Central courtyard theme,
yes,
in plan,
yes,
was originally not European.
No, it's not European at all. No.
Plan-wise also.
Yes. Well, no, that's right. But again, that comes out of Mesopotamia originally. You know, and then of course, you know, Roman houses take that on. So you go around Pompeii, and it's full of courtyard houses. Every rich person has his courtyard house in the Roman times, because that's what suits the climate. But the origins of that courtyard house are in Babylon and Mesopotamia, because of the perfectly adapted to the climate. So most definitely, yes, cloisters. Cloisters were brought into Europe, copying that style from mosque courtyards, most definitely.
And the madrasa, which is common for the present universities.
Yes, and hospitals as well. That's right. Yes, the establishment of hospitals based around mosques. So the European Christians saw all of that and how advanced it was in Cairo and in Syria, during the Crusades, and brought the ideas back and then built on it. And then, of course, don't mention anything about where the ideas came from. But there's one very interesting case, actually, of a pope. I'm trying to remember what he was called now. A pope in the 10th or 11th century. He studied Pope Sylvester. That's right. That's his name. He ran away from his monastery in France because he wanted to learn about Arab science, and so he spent some time in northern Spain, and he went and studied with a Saracen philosopher, it said. And he even went to Kairouan and learnt a great deal and studied with, top Islamic scholars. And then he became the Pope, So it was, there are some striking examples of cross-cultural, successful cross-cultural people, but it sort of comes down to the people, actually, at the end of the day, where a few exceptional people are able to bridge the gaps. But there just aren't very many of them, unfortunately. Yes, culture flows, yes.
Thank you so much for that. We do have to end there. It was a pleasure to have you and have those insights. And thank you very much. Please give me a round of applause. And just a reminder, the next week we have Sheikh Muhammad Yasin Davji, who will be speaking on the 50 Imam Shahadat. The week after we have Sheikh Hibbullah, who will be speaking to us on different ways to understand the mission of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And the week after, or 2 weeks after, we have Matt Card, who will be speaking to us about his book, Blood and Faith, The Purging of Muslim Spain. So hopefully you can join us for those in the future. Salat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.